Okay, thanks everyone for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started here. We're excited to have Claudia Kousoulas, and I think I pronounced that properly this time, here today to give a presentation on her book. First of all, let's go over a few quick announcements. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function, and those will be sent to me, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. We may not be able to answer all of them. If you do have more questions after the end of the talk, please feel free to reach out to me. My name is Matt Gagel. I'm the Outreach and Volunteer Manager at Montgomery History. And you can contact me at mgagle, that's M-G-A-G-L-E, at montgomeryhistory.org. I also want to thank everyone who has helped us to support Montgomery History and our programming. We do appreciate it. We could not offer these programs without your help. If you would like to help us continue to offer these programs, please feel free to visit our website at montgomeryhistory.org and click on the Donate Now button. We do appreciate your support, and we could not do this without you. Also want to point out we do have a slightly different schedule for next week's talks, as it is Memorial Day weekend, even though we may not be able to go as many places as we would like to. But on Wednesday, Montgomery History Speakers Bureau member Don Huseley, I believe is how he pronounces his last name, who is also the president of the Mid-Potomac chapter of the Archaeological Society of Maryland, will be joining us to discuss the various archaeological sites we have in Montgomery County. We're going to be doing this one slightly differently. It's going to be interactive with some quizzes that you can take during the talk, and to kind of jumpstart your brain on archaeology in our county. So we're looking forward to that. It will be quite interesting. And again, I mispronounced his name. It's Huseley. So Don Huseley will be with us. So that'll be next Wednesday at 1 p.m. So not our normal time, but again, that's partly due to Memorial Day weekend. But Wednesday at 1 p.m. Don Huseley will be joining us to give his presentation on the archaeological sites in Montgomery County. With that, I would like to go ahead and introduce our speaker today, who is joining us. Her name is Claudia Kousoulas, she has worked as a planner in Montgomery County for more than 20 years and lived in the county for 30 years. She is a freelance writer and editor whose work covers architecture, urbanism, design, cooking, and culinary history. With that, I'd like to welcome Claudia. Claudia, thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and turn your video camera on for us.
Okay. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Matt. I guess it's working?
It looks like it's working. The audio is a little choppy, but that could just be because we started it. So.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining today, and I'm going to switch right over to my slideshow, and we can get started. So I'm going to share screen, share, and there we are. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk today about the agricultural reserve, the value that it brings to Montgomery County. I think a lot of people don't realize that we have an agricultural reserve. They drive by this open land and they sort of use words like empty and vacant, when in fact there are there's a lot of activity going on, and there are a lot of decisions that made it what it is today. And so that's what I want to tell you about. My colleague and I, whoops, I'm not able, let's see. There we go. My colleague and I, Ellen Letourneau, took this on as an independent project. And as Matt said, we came at it from different directions. As Matt said, I worked as a planner for Montgomery County, and I was always tasked to the down county. And in master plans, I would write something like, the density is, reallocated from the up county to the down county to preserve farmland and to make best use of infrastructure that we've invested in with our tax dollars. I thought I knew what the Ag Reserve was about, but of course, doing this book gave me much deeper insight into the people and into the history and into the value that it brings to our whole region. Ellen came at it from a slightly different direction. She was new to the county, found herself living in the reserve, and didn't exactly know what it was. And so she decided to educate herself. And, she worked out there, she met people, she volunteered, and has really become part of the community out there. We decided to do the book as not as a cookbook, because really, who wants to read a land use story or a zoning story? But a cookbook, with recipes and beautiful pictures, is a real reflection of what goes on out in the reserve. And it's a place that we can all gather around the table and in the kitchen and really look at the unique place that the reserve is. Before I go on, I'm going to tell you where you can buy this wonderful book. It's on our website, breadandbeauty.org, and I'll have that address up at the end of the talk. But you should also know that our proceeds go to the Manna Food Center. So we like the idea of keeping this all in the community. Now, another reason we wrote the book was to really show the hard work of farming. And you can just see by this picture of Courtney Buckholtz that it is hard physical work, but it's also very challenging mental work. We talked to someone and he said to us, I've never met a dumb farmer. And it's true. He's met a lot of cranky farmers, but never a dumb farmer. They just don't last. It requires a lot of creative mental work to be a successful farmer. We were talking to one of our farmers out there, Amanda Cather of Plow and Stars Farm. She was describing her day to us, and we realized Amanda is an entomologist, a mechanic, a soil scientist, a veterinarian, a botanist, a climatologist, a marketer, a banker. You never know what you're going to face when you get up in the morning. And so it requires flexibility and knowledge. So when you're paying a lot of money for your food at the farm market or from your CSA, you're paying for quality, you're paying for knowledge, and you're paying for the value of preserving local land and local food. Now, just to orient you, here's where the Ag Reserve is. It's in the northern part of Montgomery County, and you can see that it is pretty, except for a few incursions, it is contiguous land. And that is important, because having land that is contiguous leaves room for related industries. It minimizes land use conflicts. Your neighbors are also farmers. They understand that sometimes farming smells bad, that tractors go slowly, and they understand you can share resources. And it also gives farmers flexibility to expand and shift their businesses. They can rent a field next to theirs and expand when the demand does. It's just the way stores gather on a main street or in a mall, and just the way offices focus on a downtown. This is an agricultural region that can be mutually supportive. Now, it's interesting to me because we gave a talk in Boston, and to give people a sense of the scale and size of it, we overlaid the reserve onto towns up there. And I realized that the reserve covers like 6 or 8 towns. And that's significant because, Belmont can't just turn to Arlington and say, now you're a farm. It just doesn't work that way. But being in Montgomery County, a single jurisdiction, means that we can make that decision about land use. It doesn't make it a necessarily easy decision, but it does make it possible and easier. Now, of course, the whole region at one time was farmland, and that affected the appearance of the area, its economy, the distribution of political power, and social life and trading. But of course, this is the national capital. And so there was pressure for development right from the very beginning. Population in Montgomery County increased tenfold between 1920 and 1960. But there were certain decisions that were made that changed the way we use and value land in Montgomery County. Two national security decisions, the Eisenhower freeway system and the dispersal of federal agencies into suburbs, really drew development out into Montgomery County and changed the way we were living out here. In 1955, the Atomic Energy Commission came to Montgomery County. In 1960, planning for Metro began. In 1961, NIST moved to the county. In 1964, the Beltway opened up, and you can see it there. I think it probably looked like that for about 15 minutes. And in 1978, the county got its first Metro stop. Development began to seem inevitable. Farming felt antique, perhaps not necessary anymore, but not everyone agreed with that. And so one of the first people who recognized the value of preserving farming in Montgomery County was Law Watkins. His family had farmed for a number of generations in the county, and what he did was talk to some of his neighbors about putting an easement on their land that would have limited future development, lowered their taxes, but limited future development and lowered the value of their land. He convinced 3 of them to put their land in easement, and that was really that first chunk of important contiguous land in the county preserved for agriculture. Now, of course, the county was also looking at doing this and thought perhaps it would be a good idea. And they wanted to preserve agriculture, not just as a view or a pretty place or a place for large estate homes, but as an activity, as a function, as an economy. And so they did research into soil and water, development patterns, access, land use, and determined that there was, in fact, room for both development and agriculture in the county, and that they needed to develop some policies and actions to do that. So in the Rural and Open Space Plan, they established some of those policies. And there were some other things going on at the same time that helped preserve farming. You might remember in the 1970s that high commodity prices really raised the price of meat, and it became very expensive. And so that gave farmers a profit. So there was a little bit of, easing in the pressure to sell their land for development. The state of Maryland was also looking at ways, different programs to preserve farmland. But the plan laid out a few policies. It limited sewer extensions, and that, of course, limited development. It took the outer beltway off the map, and that meant that it was no longer a planned or funded facility. But they still had to preserve the land. How do you preserve all that land? Well, I guess they could have bought it, but of course that would have been ridiculously expensive. It would have been impossible. They also could have condemned it and said, we're taking this land for the public good. But of course, you're going to spend the next 100 years in court fighting those cases. So they decided to rezone the land out in the reserve. Before the rezoning, you could build 5 houses on 25 acres. After the rezoning, you could only build 1 house on 25 acres. So farmers had lost that value of 4 houses on their property. And that was money out of their pockets. And so there needed to be a way to resolve what the planning board chairman at the time, Royce Hanson, called the equity problem. Well, they came up with a tool called transferable development rights. It set up sending areas, like the agricultural land in the top slide, that would shift their development to receiving areas, like urban areas in the bottom slide, Bethesda, Silver Spring, and Wheaton. And so what would happen is that a developer in the down county would go to this TDR bank, buy some TDRs, and use that to develop a little bit more density in the down county. The farmer got the cash and was able to continue farming. The developer got extra density, and the development went to an area that already had the infrastructure to serve it: schools, parks, roads, libraries, metro, things that we had already invested in and we could make the best use of. TDRs are still available. Not all of them have been sold, and they're still being used. And they have been a very successful program. It's been a model around the country to preserve open land. And you'll find Montgomery County's TDR program written up in planning textbooks if you choose to look for that. And so here's the result. You have a considerable contiguous area, a significant number of farms and horticultural businesses. We have farmers who grow commodity crops like corn and soybeans that get shipped out and processed. We have that kind of symbiotic agriculture economy, people growing hay for people who are keeping horses. And every year, Montgomery County is first or second in the state of Maryland in the production of pumpkins and strawberries. So we have table crops and things that you can enjoy at home. And you can see also that the reserve generates income for the county and for the people who are out there. Now, the other thing about preserving this land is that you preserve history. And I think that sometimes local history gets short shrift. I think particularly in DC, where you're dealing with stories of national and international events, we sometimes overlook the interesting history right in our own backyard. And I have to stop right here and thank the Montgomery County Historical Society for the research and work that they've done over the years. I use the Montgomery County Story newsletters that are held at the Library of Congress to research some of these stories, and they were invaluable. There were many more food history stories than we could use in the book, and I'm going to tell some of them here today. But it was a wonderful thing to have as a resource so that we could link land, food, and local culture. I think that's a really important thing to be able to do. So I don't have to tell, I'm sure, this audience a lot about the C&O Canal, but just quickly, you know that it always was in competition with the B&O Railroad and could never quite compete. It went through a number of bankruptcies and foreclosures. In fact, it was at one point owned by the B&O Railroad. In the 1920s, it was really knocked out as a commercial enterprise by a flood. It became popular. It was abandoned, but it became popular with bootleggers. There were vacation cottages out here into the 50s and 60s. In the 1950s, someone had the great idea to build a highway along the canal bed. Justice William O. Douglas did not think that was a good idea, so he decided to hike the length of the canal and took a Washington Post reporter with him who reported back on all the things that they saw and the value of this resource. And that, of course, got the public behind turning it into a park, and it is now part of the National Park Service. And we can all go out there and enjoy. I think it's a really wonderful combination of man-made and natural environment that is very, very unique. So, of course, the canal had a food culture. If you can imagine, it was a busy place. The mules on the towpath pulling families and boatmen who were hauling things from the Ohio Valley down to Georgetown and Alexandria ports. And of course, they had a particular way of eating on the canal. J.P. Mose recalls in an oral history that his brother, he and his brother were boatmen. His brother made biscuits. They picked up seasonal vegetables, lima beans, and corn on the cob sold from the lock keepers' gardens. and they bought bread and fruit pies. He recalled mostly pies with crust on top, sold by enterprising housewives along the canal. And so what they would do is load in Cumberland. They'd come downstream to Sharpsburg, where their mother would have clean clothes waiting for them and some pies and cakes ready. They would continue down to Georgetown, and on the way, they would eat a lot of canned goods. They kept a beer keg on the boat, but when they got to Georgetown, they would treat themselves to a nice big steak. So it's interesting to imagine this place, not as this quiet, contemplative area, but the workmen at the Seneca stone cutting mill, the noise and commotion that it generated, families on the boats, their children in and out of the school. The hotels that eventually came out here were tourist attractions. So it was a much more active place than we know it today. And of course, that food culture continued at the lock houses. There are about 6 of them, I think, in Montgomery County. You can actually stay in them. You can make a reservation. I should warn you that there is no water, no Wi-Fi, and no electrical power. That house is lit that way because my colleague Ellen is in there walking back and forth with a flashlight for the photographer who's taking a really slow exposure. Looks beautiful, but it's not accurate to what you'll find out there. But the lock keepers were responsible for opening the locks, of course, but also maintaining the canal as well. And they didn't get paid a lot of money, so they were also very enterprising. Harvey Brandt sold ice cream and sodas to Sunday tourists. He caught eels and sold them. He ran a canoe club, and he also got his coal off the boats, and used their corn to fatten his hogs, which he then slaughtered and sold back to them, along with vegetables. So even though we tried, we tried in the book to really anchor food in the place. And it's a seasonal book. There are four seasonal chapters, and at the end of each chapter, we have a special meal that takes place at a historic site. So in the spring, we're at the Seneca stone cutting mill. In the summer, we go to Brookville. In the fall, we celebrate Thanksgiving with the Montevideo hunt. And in the winter, we have a hike along the canal. Now, of course, we couldn't afford to style these photo shoots in a historically accurate way, but we did have great fun going through our cabinets and pantries to find all the different plates and dishes. Ellen and I can tell you where every single dish and napkin that appears in the book comes from. So of course we chose a menu that is seasonally appropriate and also reflective of the place. Even though nobody's growing beans in Montgomery County, we really thought we needed to have bean soup because it was such a fundamental meal for the boatmen. When you think about it, they could have a sack of dried beans, some preserved meat, they had their keg of water, and so you could always have bean soup. This is a really delicious recipe, very simple and very, very good. I can never resist including this story, even though it's slightly outside of the reserve, because I just love it. I used to live up the hill from here. This is the Cabin John Bridge. At one time, it was the longest stone span in the world for a short period of time, and so it drew a lot of visitors. And to build it, let's see, Rosa Bobinger and her husband came here, and he was going to work as a stonemason building the bridge. But they found they could make more money feeding the workmen. So they started out with sandwiches and simple food, and eventually expanded into the Cabin John Hotel. It was a popular tourist site. This is an excerpt on the slide from the Washington Post encouraging visitors, and it was visited by Presidents Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, and it was noted for a particular dish, Maryland fried chicken. Now, I'd always wondered what Maryland fried chicken was, and you know, I'd heard different things. You leave the lid on the skillet while you're frying it. It has a gravy. It doesn't have a gravy. I found this description. Maryland fried chicken is fried chicken in white cream sauce with curled strips of bacon on top. The dish, said to have originated at the hotel, was advertised as fried spring chicken, Cabin John style. So I think, in fact, Montgomery County does have a signature dish. The hotel closed in 1925 and it burned in 1931. But apparently on eBay, you can still find some of their signature ironstone china. So that was one side of the county, a place of kind of rough and tumble, the canal, boatmen coming and going, tourism, recreation. On the other side of the county, you had the Quaker settlements of Brookville and Sandy Spring and Ashton. Now, the first European settlers who came to Montgomery County wanted to live an estate lifestyle. So they grew a cash crop, tobacco, which was worked on what were described as baronial estates by armies of slaves. And so they could relax and enjoy the hunt and sell their tobacco. The problem was that the market for colonial tobacco eventually crashed, and their crop had no value, and the tobacco had drawn out all the nutrients from the soil. And so it was really, farming didn't seem to be an option in Montgomery County anymore. And it's hard to imagine, but it really did become a synonym for poverty. And you read descriptions of fallen fence rows and abandoned houses and families moving to the Ohio Valley for literally greener pastures. Now, at the same time, though, the Quakers came in and thought that they could return the fertility to the soil. And they used a couple of techniques. Peruvian guano became readily available at that time as a fertilizer. They did things like crop rotation, and they also formed the Farmers Club of Sandy Spring, where they could share information and technology and ideas. And their knowledge eventually was sort of the foundation that eventually grew into the Agriculture Department, the Federal Agriculture Department. I think this is interesting, particularly because there's a contemporary parallel. Every farmer that we talked to said that their first crop and their first priority, their first product is soil. And if they don't have good soil, they're not going to have a successful farm or a good product. And each of them deal with it a different way, but it is something that they are all incredibly attentive to. Now, of course, another aspect of farming is technology. And the Quakers were a very inventive group, and there were a number of patents taken out, but this one appealed to me very much. It is Thomas More, who has invented a refrigerator. This is his note to Thomas Jefferson, inviting him to take a look at it, and that's Jefferson's sketch of the refrigerator down in the corner. It's a oval wooden box set inside with a tin box, and between that the ice is packed around. The whole thing is wrapped in a rabbit skin and then in a woolen cloth to insulate it. And this allowed Moore to get his butter. It could hold 22 pints of butter. This allowed him to get it to the market in DC, fresher and cooler, and he could charge more money for it. And apparently Jefferson bought one and was a fan of it, but not everyone agreed with him. His granddaughter, Ellen, recalled a trip to Poplar Forest in 1819 in a letter, and she wrote, "Grandpapa insisted on our using that filthy cooler, refrigerator, I believe he calls it, which wasted our small stock of ice and gave us butter that run about the plate so that we could scarcely catch it." I really love the way that eye roll transcends time. Let's see. This is Elizabeth Ellicott Lea. She was an inspiration for us. In 1847, she wrote a cookbook called Domestic Cookery, Useful Receipts and Hints to Young Housekeepers. She had come to Montgomery County as a young bride and sadly was widowed very young and was left to run the farm on her own, which was a challenge. And so what she did was, as many women did, write down her recipes and her household techniques for herself, but also because she did it in duplicate because she didn't want her daughter to be in the same situation. So she wrote down everything she knew. A Baltimore doctor got a look at this thing and decided to publish it. And the book eventually went through 19 editions. It was a bestseller in its time. And she undertook the book, in the introduction it says, not to share elegant preparations, but the far more useful part of household duties. It's interesting to me that this book was not mentioned in her obituary. By that time, food fashion had kind of moved on from her. Her heavy farm dishes, it required a lot of work. If you read some of the recipes, the way she does things is not easy. And at that time, people wanted, there were what we would call convenience foods. You didn't have to bake your own bread. You could buy canned meat. And so she kind of fell out of fashion. And so people had kind of forgotten about the book. I also like her attitude toward charity, and it's not that when you have extra you should share it with people, but in fact you should be thrifty so that you can generate income that you can share with people, which I think is kind of a very nice way to look at things. We used her for an inspiration, as I said, you know, whenever we sort of were facing a pile of potatoes or a glut of something, or, oh my goodness, how do we make chicken interesting and anchor it here in Montgomery County? We would look and say, well, what is Elizabeth Ellicott Lea doing? And in fact, she had this rather elegant recipe for cold chicken with vinegar that inspired us. Our chicken with vinegar is a hot dish. We don't ask you to crack the bones or stew it over hot embers, but it's really quite a nice dish nonetheless. Let's see where we are. Now, you know, another aspect of local history, I think we often think of Washington, D.C. and the surrounding communities as part of the Union, when in fact the lands around here were contested areas. We are just 40 miles from the Pennsylvania line, and so there was a lot of Underground Railroad activity. We have Quaker communities who were active in abolition, and there were farmers who operated their farms with slave labor. And you can see on the one side there, that's an advertisement from a Rockville newspaper, one of many, to a reward for a runaway slave. On the other side of the slide there, you see a history of the Confederate service in Montgomery County, recalling who the local men were who served in the Confederate Army. And in fact, I was over in Leesburg, I think it's in St. Patrick's Church, and there's a stained glass window to Elijah Veers White, and you can see him there in his uniform, honored in that window. But you can see this was written just after the Civil War, and that, you know, these were still contested issues and contested land. And it's interesting to me to think about the relationship actually between Virginia and Montgomery and Maryland and Loudoun and Montgomery. You know, at that time there was a lot of ferry service across the Potomac. And so the trading ties, the social ties were very strong between those two communities. You know, now we have to virtually drive into DC and back out again to get to Loudoun. It was probably a quicker and more convenient trip back then. Now, Virginia Campbell Moore, she ran a farm what is now around Cedar Lane near NIH. And she was in Montgomery County during the Civil War and recalled life here in the county during the war in a 1913 letter to her grandson. They had come home from church one Sunday and were planning to share a fried chicken lunch at their home with some friends, and found two Union officers at the fence asking to be served lunch. And she writes to her grandson, "There was nothing to do but share it with the self-invited guests. However, they did not suffer, for you know our habit of always having cold ham, and we wisely checked our hospitality when it reached the frozen custard, which was not put on exhibition until the Yanks were gone." So you can see you have to share your lunch with the occupying army. You do not have to give them your ice cream, however. Now, on the other side, you have the Underground Railroad and the escape from slavery. I'm sure you're all familiar with Tony Cohen, who you can see curled up in a box down there at the bottom. He's the author of The Underground Railroad in Montgomery County, a history and driving guide, where he traces clues to the Underground Railroad throughout the county. Today, he operates Button Farm, where he offers experiential history. And this is sort of what he's doing here. He's recreating this act where a runaway slave had himself mailed north. And Tony wanted to experience just what that was like. And he has a very vivid story about that. And that's another aspect of saving this land. You can go out to Button Farm. He won't put you in a box, but you can see a farm of that era and experience the farm work and the environment that they lived in. Of course, you know that Montgomery County was home to Josiah Henson, who inspired Uncle Tom's Cabin. He was born here, which is, I guess you'd call this North Bethesda, and he was sold up to a farm in Rockville as a child and then came back here later, and I think lived again with his mother and family. And he recalled what they ate as slaves on the plantation. In the summer, they added a little bit of buttermilk and vegetables, which each might raise for himself and his family on a little piece of ground which was assigned to him for the purpose, called the truck patch. They had 2 meals a day, breakfast at noon after a morning's work, and the other when the work day was over. He also recalled an underground economy of, in quotes, stray chickens and midnight visits to the apple orchard. And he also describes a technique that to preserve the vegetables over the cold months. You dig a hole, layer it in, straw vegetables, and then cover the hole with dirt. And during the winter, you would dig out what you needed. And this is a technique that is described in recollections of both white and black farms. Now, after the Civil War, freedmen's communities were formed, a number of them in Montgomery County and throughout the region as well. This is Sugarland, and they were, it was formed by Gwen Hebron Reese's great-grandfather on land that had been deeded to him by his former owner. And the pattern of these freedmen's communities were pretty similar. They were clusters of houses, family groups probably, And they often built 3 buildings: a church, a school, and a community building. At Sugarland, the school and the community building are gone, but the church remains. It has been deconsecrated, and Gwen Hebron Reese has established it as the Sugarland Ethnohistory Foundation. And she's working very hard to preserve the community's history through artifacts and research, the building itself, and also surveying the area for grave sites so that they can be marked. You know, it's hard work. And when we were interviewing her, she told us that, you know, she just thought about what her ancestors had been through and she couldn't let it go. And so that is what keeps her going today. At the same time we interviewed her, I happened to be reading Edna Lewis's book, A Taste of the South, I think. And she also grew up in a freedmen's community in Virginia and records her history. She records many of the same things that Gwen told us about: the communal aspect of the settlement, sharing everything, very seasonable with what they how they celebrated and how they ate. Gwen told us that after the fields were harvested for sale, the women and children would go through and glean whatever was left. Everybody would come to the community building where they'd can and preserve what they had gleaned. And as she said, it didn't matter how many jars you brought, everybody went home with the same amount. They also both recalled the revival meetings in August, and let's see. Oh yes, and Martha Sprigg Poole, who was a member of the Montgomery County Historical Society, recalls in her 1969 description of farm life in the 1920s that August was the farmer's holiday. No pressing tasks had to be done. Farm communities used this month to have social enjoyment, such as picnics and fairs, to take trips, or just to rest. And Gwen recalled, in fact, going to revival meetings in August, and so does Edna Lewis. It's part of that. It's a seasonal way of living that we don't see much anymore. Of course, the county also has more thoroughly documented history, and this is Montevideo off of River Road. Montevideo was built by the Peter family. The wife was the great-granddaughter of Martha Custis Washington, and the house is modeled on the family's Georgetown home, Tudor Place, which was designed by William Thornton, who also designed the Capitol. And there's some thought that Thornton might have worked on this house as well. They are both federal-style houses. You can see that very upright, formal facade. The house is arranged symmetrically around a center hallway, and the center door with its fan light and side lights, that's a very particular federal feature. The house is built out of Seneca sandstone, which you can just see at the bottom in the foundation. The steps are brick, but the foundation has the exposed sandstone. That was quarried at the family's Seneca stone cutting mill, which is really just kind of just sort of across River Road down by the river. And you'll recognize that stone because you've seen it all over Washington. There are brownstones built of it, and most notably the Smithsonian Castle. So the family is very proud. The family was very proud of their connection to George Washington. And this is a cake that Martha Custis copied out for family members from Martha Custis's own cookbook, her own recipe book, I should call it. This is from a wonderful book, by the way, called Dining with the Washingtons. It's a collection of recipes and pictures and essays by historians historians on all aspects of food and farm production at Mount Vernon. It's really a wonderful book. We, of course, felt we had to include a fruit cake. Ours does not call for 40 eggs or 4 pounds of butter. It's a much simpler cake, but I think it's probably just as good. We've seen some parallels through history and soil and technology. I think there's another parallel that we need to point out, and that's finding a market. A lot of the farmers in Montgomery County now, they're different farmers, but they have different ways of selling. Some go to the farm markets, some have a CSA, some do both, some are commodity farmers. So there's that's part of doing the farming, is finding a product, finding a market and creating products that they want, either through raw materials or added value. And so this, of course, is the Farm Women's Market. And if you haven't read Mama Wears Two Aprons by Margaret Coleman, I encourage you to look at it. I'm sure it's in the collection of the Historical Society, and it is in the Montgomery County Libraries. I find the market was established during the 30s when farms were really struggling. And I find it very moving that these women took their domestic skills, moved them into a commercial sector, and really made a difference in the lives of their family and in the county, in the county's prosperity. In fact, in 1940, the Reader's Digest wrote, "The modernizing movement has proved to be contagious. The example of the women in the cooperative," the agent told me, "has put the county 50 years ahead in its agricultural ideas. It is no longer necessary to argue up-to-date farm practices. Even more important, we're proving to the youth of the county that farming can be made to pay and farm life can be made attractive." So you can see that a market, determining a market and a product is really an important part of farming. Now I'm going to bounce back for a minute to Elizabeth Ellicott Lea. Her cookbook was analyzed by culinary historian William Wise Weaver. He looked at her recipes and what was included and how she made them to really try to understand this community. Cookbooks can be very revealing history. And one of the things he noted was the diversity of her recipes. And he writes, "Everyone sat at the table." And of course, Montgomery County is a very diverse place today, but the diversity in Elizabeth Ellicott Lea's time is very different from the diversity we know. In her recipes, he finds the influence of Germans in fruit butters, the English in the recipes for pies, Native Americans with green corn and succotash, Africans brought okra to the table, and of course, the Quakers were teetotalers. And so their social events revolved around sweets, cakes, and ice creams. And today, of course, Montgomery County is still a very diverse place, but in a different way. This is the Buddhist temple out on River Road. You'll also find Red Wiggler, where developmentally disabled adults are farming and feeding their communities through the farm's CSA. This is the Buddhist temple. There's also the Dayspring Farm, which offers spiritual retreat. Madison Fields works with people who are autistic. There are Native American trails, bicycle rallies, raptor rescue. I always kind of think of this as an open canvas where people bring their ideas and their energy to really pursue something that they find important. And I think that diversity, there's room for that diversity out here because of the land. We also tried to be diverse as well in our recipes and sort of point out that cooking local doesn't have to mean being parochial in your tastes. This recipe was inspired by a visitor to the Buddhist retreat who went to a nearby farm and saw that they were growing peppers. she brought them back to the temple and made this Bhutanese dish for everyone. It's called emadatse, and it's kind of a cheesy pepper fondue kind of stew. It's really delicious. Authentically, it's made with much hotter peppers than we recommend. But that's the beauty of, I think, cooking with local produce. You have to be flexible and creative, just the way the farmers are. And this is a really wonderful dish, especially if you can enjoy it with some of Ellen's sourdough bread. So the diversity really does extend to the people who are farming out there, the way they farm, and the way the products they offer. So we have in the reserve generational farms where kids have just taken over the business, other generational farms that have expanded and changed the business. You might be familiar with Waradeka, which started as a recreation camp. It went into horsing, horses, and now it's run also as an artisan brewery. We have land-link farmers and tenant farmers, and we have farmers who've inherited their land and who have managed to buy their own land in the county. There are farmers who specialize, like Andrea Langworthy at Banner Bees, and there are farmers who create value-added products like Rockland's wine. And there's entertainment out here. Bunnyland, apparently at Easter, is a huge event at Butler's Farm. There are pizza ovens, music, weddings. There's hiking and recreation. I think what we see here is that there's not a single solution or a single way to farm. But when you have this preserved land, there's room for all different kinds of approaches and products. So I hope that you've enjoyed the talk. I hope that when we are all able to roam and enjoy our community, you'll come out to the reserve and really find some of its value for yourself. So thank you, and I'm glad to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, thank you, Claudia. Again, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function. We'll get to as many of those as we can. Give everyone a second here. Again, thanks, Claudia. We do also have copies of the book in our museum shop, but obviously nobody can go there right now. So again, once we're free to roam, you're welcome to stop by and pick up a copy of that. I don't see any comments. I guess we'll give it another minute or so here. Again, use the Q&A button and we'll get to those. In the meantime, I'll just like to remind everybody that our next history conversation will be next Wednesday, which is the date that I can't remember, the 27th at 1 p.m. with Don Housley. We're excited for that one. And yeah, I guess I'm not seeing any questions. So Claudia, any closing thoughts or anything you want to close up on? Anyway, obviously, Bread and Beauty is the website.
Yes.
A lot of comments saying great presentation, so that's some good feedback for you.
Thank you.
All right, well, I guess if you do have questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is mgagel@montgomeryhistory.org. Or I believe you can probably contact Claudia. Oh, okay, here's a question.
Great.
Somebody snuck it in here real quick. Says, but do farmers get a tax break?
Well, yes, in the sense that the ability to develop their land and generate more income from it has been taken away. So you're taxed accordingly. Your land has less value for development. And so what preserves the land is two things. It's that zoning, which limits how much development can happen there. But a lot of the land, I think it's 75% of the reserve, is actually preserved by easement, which is what the limit that the owner puts on. And again, they pay less in taxes because you're taking out, you have fewer development rights.
Someone says, is 10 Mile Creek really protected?
Oh my God. That is a current political issue, and I would encourage you to look at the Montgomery Countryside Alliance and see what they have to say about it. They are advocating for its protection, and they would be much more knowledgeable about it than I am.
I did get a question on Facebook as well. It says, how significant was the development, oh, excuse me, how significant was the establishment of the Ag Reserve to this cultural development?
I think that the Ag Reserve is very significant. I mean, if you look at it's, first of all, it's incredible value for the county. It protects our air and water. It provides local food. It provides different kinds of local jobs. It's recreation. It supports our economy. It's also unique in the region. I mean, you know, Fairfax has no farms left. And we gave a tour to urban planners from the region back in, I guess it was in the spring, and many of them were from counties who were looking to do a similar kind of thing. They recognize the value of preserving farmland. And I should also point out that there are only about 20 agricultural reserves in the whole country. And by any measure, Montgomery County is one of the largest, one of the oldest, and one of the most successful. So I think it's been a really incredible resource for us, and I hope it will be in the future as well.
Okay, well, I guess we'll wrap it up there. Again, if you have any questions that we didn't get to, please feel free to email them to me. My name is Matt Gagel. I'm the Outreach and Volunteer Manager at Montgomery History. My email is mgagel@montgomeryhistory.org. And Claudia, any closing thoughts? Anything else you want to add?
No, just when you can, cook local and be creative.
Okay, all right. And with that, we'll wrap things up and we'll see everyone next Wednesday. Thanks again, Claudia.
Thank you.